In this lesson, we're going to talk about UVs and how to generate UVs inside of ZBrush. UVs, like organized meshes, are something that's important to understand how to create so you can get your work out of ZBrush and into a pipeline. Now, an organized mesh, we have an entire chapter that's just on retopology in ZBrush using ZRemesher and the topology brush, as well as ZModeler. That's for creating an animatable base mesh as opposed to a Dynamesh mesh, which is just basically an evenly distributed set of quads that are sort of shrink wrapped all over the model. An animatable topology is going to be something where you've got edge looping. So this was created with ZRemesher. So you see we've got loops around the eyes and the mouth, for example, and the ears. And this just allows us to organize the mesh better. And it's very, very helpful when you're generating UVs to have your mesh organized this way. So an organized mesh is creating the base model, which will be taken out of ZBrush. UV coordinates are a way of getting your poly paint, which here you can see if we turn off frame mode and go back up to our highest subdivision level. And if we go to our subtools and turn off poly paint, you can see that our poly paint we would bake into a texture map. And that texture map, if I go down to the texture map menu here, you see we do not have a texture right now, but if we go to poly paint, we have poly paint that we can turn on and off. Now, poly paint mainly just lives in ZBrush. You can export poly paint as vertex color. You can export it with the 3D print exporter, for example. You can export it with STL files and others. But if you're going into a film or game pipeline, you need to have a texture map. A texture map is a two-dimensional image where your poly paint has been baked in to a 2D image, and the UV coordinates allow you to wrap that two-dimensional image around a three-dimensional object with a minimum of distortion. So the best way I can sort of illustrate that is if you think of a soccer ball. If you imagine a football, a soccer ball, and imagine if you were to slice it apart along each seam, you could unwrap it flat. So here I've got a polysphere. This is just a ZBrush polysphere. You can find it under the Lightbox tool menu, polysphere. And this comes with UVs already applied to it. If I go to the tool menu and then go to UV map, I can click this button here, Morph UV. You see this flattens out the UVs, and we can see how this three-dimensional object has been flattened into a two-dimensional plane. You'll also notice that ZBrush tries to render some of the dimensionality to that. That's to assist you in spotting details in your maps. And you can also paint in this view, which we'll talk about later. If I click Morph UV again, it will bring it back to its three-dimensional form. And you can adjust that bump display here with this slider. So that, in the most simple terms, is what UV mapping does. It allows you to take a three-dimensional object, unwrap it flat, so then you can paint a two-dimensional map or apply a two-dimensional map to it. Now, there's a variety of ways that we can generate UVs inside of ZBrush. I'm going to show you some of the earlier methodologies here, which are not probably the best ones to use now that we're going to be able to use UV Master, but I do want you to know that they're here and understand what they do. So if I go to the UV map menu, and let's go back to our alien here. I'm going to step down to my lowest subdivision level, and I'm going to go to UV map, and I'm going to Morph UV. Here you can see the UVs that were generated in ZBrush for this creature. We'll talk about how to do this in just a moment. Notice that those are human readable. They're very, very clear. It's obvious where the head is. It's obvious where the antenna are and the ears are. You could open this in Photoshop and paint on top of it. It's very easy to read. Now, there's other methods of creating UVs here. First off, I'm going to set my resolution. We'll set it to 4K, and I'll leave UV border just at 2 pixels. Now we have UV cylindrical, UV spherical, UV planar, and UV box. These are just primitive shapes. If I was working with a cylindrical form, I could apply cylindrical UVs, spherical, planar, etc. Most of these I don't use. I will use planar sometimes if I want to extract a map from a 3D plane, but generally these are not really used. We have these UV coordinates here. We have AUV tiles, AUV tiles, GUV tiles, and PUV tiles. Now, these have been in ZBrush for quite some time. We'll start with AUV tiles. If I click that, it doesn't look like anything happened, but it has effectively replaced the UVs. If you generate new UVs, it will delete the current UV set. So if I click Morph UV again, now you can see what's been done here. Each face has been given its own little section of that texture map. So if you imagine that this is a 4K square texture map, every single pixel is being used for texture. Unlike that previous UV that I showed you that had various islands and negative spaces around it, this uses every bit of pixel density. All the texel density is being used. Now that's very, very efficient, but the problem is it's not human readable. You could not open this map and read it in Photoshop. You wouldn't be able to tell what was what. Automatic mapping like this is not used in pipelines. I have seen assets come through with Maya's automatic mapping, but it's really frowned upon, and I ended up redoing that. So if you do use something like this, you would use it on your personal projects, maybe, but there's better ways to go about it now. But again, I want you to know that they're here. Here we have PUV tiles. And if I unfold this, you'll see that these are a little bit larger. These are called packed UV tiles. Once again, it uses all the texel density, but it's not human readable. If I turn off Morph UV, it'll come back to its three-dimensional form. And then we have group UV tiles. And this is a little bit more readable, but it's still not something that you would want to have to sort of shepherd through a pipeline, where if there was an artifact you needed to paint out or something you wanted to adjust, you just wouldn't be able to do that effectively. So while these are efficient and quick, they're not the most recommended way of creating UVs now. A few versions ago, ZBrush introduced a tool called UV Master, and that's under the Z plugin menu, and we're going to talk about that now. So if I go to Z plugin, tear this menu off, you'll find UV Master here. Now, UV Master is an automated UV solution. It will generate automatic UVs, but it generates them in a human-readable fashion. So let's take a look at how this works. I'm going to step down to my lowest subdivision level, and you'll notice the first button is Unwrap. You might be tempted to click that, but that's actually not what you do. We don't work on our model in UV Mapper. We come down here and click Work on Clone. Work on Clone will create a copy of the mesh. You see it here in the tool menu now, CL Alien Bust. And it applies the skin shader. And what this does is it gives us a base upon which to work with no subdivision levels. We can generate our UVs here. Then we'll take our UVs, copy them, and paste them onto our existing model. So what I want to do now is I want to generate a new UV set. So I'm going to click Unwrap. I have symmetry turned on because it is a symmetrical mesh, and here we go. We can see the UV seams that were generated. If your check seams button is turned off, you won't see those, so you have to turn that on to see those seams. If I click Flatten, I can see the actually unwrapped mesh. So this is not ideal. You can see that we've got one big island for the entire character, and the seam runs sort of asymmetrically down the center of the face. So it's not the best solution. So let's go ahead and unflatten this. What we need to do is we need to give ZBrush input on where we want our seams to be. So to do that, I am going to make a couple changes here using control painting. So turn on Enable Control Painting. And here we have Protect, Attract, and Erase. So Protect will allow me to paint poly paint on areas that I want to protect from getting seams. Attract will allow me to paint on areas I want to attract seams. So you'll notice Protect is red, Attract is blue. We're on the paintbrush, and it's set to just RGB. So we'll do Protect first. I'll turn my draw size up, and I'll turn on X symmetry. And I'm just going to paint the front of the face here. Basically, I'm telling ZBrush with this color coding, protect this area. Do everything you can not to put UV seams here. Now I'll mouse around to the back, and I'll switch to Attract. And I'm going to say, ZBrush, do everything you can to put a seam here. The blue attracts seams, the red repels them. We'll go to Protect, and let's go ahead and paint that red right up to here. You want to keep this as general as possible. You can't really paint down to a fine line, but you can paint sort of a region like this, maybe a little bit smaller. So let's see what we get with this. It's not going to be perfect because we have these antennae here, but it should be an improvement over what we had before. So I'll just click Unwrap again. And now you see we get our seam running down the back. It's not quite down the center, and it sort of shoots off at an angle there, but it's definitely an improvement. If I click Flatten, Here you can see the resulting mesh. So I think what we're going to want to do is we'll want to cut out things like the ears and the antenna, because you see those are actually sort of definitely going to get some distortion there. If you look at what's happening in the antenna, ZBrush just can't solve for those areas because it's trying to keep them attached to the rest of the head. So let's go ahead and unflatten. And if we go into frame mode, you'll notice that we have polygroups created for the antennas and the ears. And polygroups are very easy to create. You simply isolate a section of mesh with visibility. That's Control, Shift, Click, and Drag. You could also use B for brush, S for select, L for lasso. Click OK, and then that gives you a lasso selection like this. So it's very, very easy to isolate areas. You can also zoom in and Control, Shift, click on an edge to hide edge rings like this when you're in lasso mode. So that's pretty handy as well. And once you have your area isolated, you simply go to Polygroup and click Group Visible or Auto Grouping. We talk about polygroups more in our other chapters, but suffice to say here, I have polygrouped these areas that I want to split out from the mesh. And this model is available for you with the downloads for this video, so you can open this and experiment with it on your own. So to utilize these, I'm going to turn on polygroups. That's going to tell ZBrush, I want you to cut the UVs where I have polygroups and make those separate islands. So I'll turn off frame mode with Shift F, and I'll go back to Attract. I'm going to turn my draw size down. Let's zoom into the back of these antennae. And I'm just going to paint a little blue seam running down the back of the antenna. And this is just a way of telling ZBrush, do everything you can to attract the seams here. And I'm going to go to Protect, and I'm going to narrow the seam going down the back of the head by painting red over it. By the way, if I click and drag and then press the Shift key, you see I get this line. I can draw a straight line by letting go of Shift. So that's click, press Shift and drag, and it gives me a little angle readout there. Let go of Shift and it will execute that stroke. So for example, if I were to erase here and then switch to Attract, turn my draw size down, click, press and hold Shift, and then bring that line straight up, let go of Shift, it will draw that straight along that guideline. So let's go ahead and narrow this down again. Oops, that's too much. That might be a little too much, but we'll see. All right, so we've got Protect for just about all the mesh and Attract going along the back. And we're going to go ahead and isolate the ears. I'm just Control Shift clicking on the ears to hide that polygroup. Control Shift click and drag on the background to reveal all, or to invert visibility, I mean. Let's go to Attract, and I'm just going to paint blue on the backs of the ears here. And I'll paint red on the front. Control Shift click on the background to reveal all. And now let's go ahead and unwrap again with that guide painting in place. So I click Unwrap. Remember, Polygroups is now turned on, and there we go. Look at that. We get a nice seam running right down the back of the head, and we get the seams running along the back of the antenna. We've got a seam running around the border of the ear, and a seam that runs up back of the ear, just like we wanted. Now, we might be able to improve this seam a little bit if we go back into Control Painting, go back to Protect. It runs quite high up the head, so let's go ahead and try and limit it to about there. Unwrap it again. And you see it's getting better. We're still getting a little sort of, it's not a big deal, but if you are OCD, you might want to fix that. So we'll go to Protect and just paint that. Maybe paint, oops, that's too much. Maybe paint a little bit of limitation on the sides here. Unwrap again. And there we go. Let's go ahead and unwrap this. So let's go ahead and flatten it, I mean to say. And there you go. We get a nice, symmetrical, human-readable UV for the head, for the antenna, and the ears. And you see that it's automatically laid it out to get the head as large as it can on this UV region. and it's laid out the other islands next to it, and it's keeping everything at the same size. That's very important as well. We want the ratio in the sizes to remain consistent. So these are quite good. These are definitely reasonable UVs. So I'm going to unflatten. Now, how do we get the UVs off of this head and onto our Z tool? Well, it's very simple. You just click Copy UVs. Let's go back to our original head and then click Paste UVs. It's as simple as that. And you could do that with an imported OBJ as well. If you've laid out UVs in another program, you can import an OBJ into ZBrush, just simply copy UVs and paste them in here. That's a very handy utility to know that's available. So now that I've pasted the UVs onto this head, if I go back to my UV map menu and click Morph UV, here you can see it has applied those UVs. And of course, we can control our bump here. If I turn that up, that will adjust how strong that bump effect actually is. So set that back down. I believe that was set to 50 by default. And there we go. Now that we have UVs, we can step back up to our highest subdivision level. And we'll talk about extracting maps in another chapter, but just so you understand the point of this, if I go to Texture Map, I have a menu here called Create, and if I create New from Polypaint, it will bake out my poly painting into those UVs. So that is a texture map that I can now export from ZBrush, load up into an external program, and actually see my texture on the model. So you can use that in a game engine, you can use that in Maya, you can use that in a visual effects pipeline. It's sort of a fundamental skill that you need to have to get something out of ZBrush and into a pipeline. You can get things out of ZBrush in terms of keyshot rendering, which I do quite a bit in art department and concept, because I don't need to have an animatable mesh when I'm creating a concept. I will do some things because it makes the workflow easier, like having an organized base mesh can be much, much easier as I'm trying to pose something. But I can render something in Keyshot and get a nice image out, or I can export something for 3D printing, and I don't need a texture map necessarily. If something's going into a previs pipeline or a visual effects pipeline, then we definitely need to have a texture map and a mesh with UVs associated with it. We'll talk more about extracting textures in depth in another lesson, so we'll get back to that later. So we've seen how we can use control painting to adjust our texture. I'm going to turn texture off, because remember, if you have texture turned on and I go to Polypaint, turn Polypaint on and off, it seems like nothing's happening. That's because what we're actually seeing right now is our texture map. So if I turn texture off, go back to Polypaint, turn Polypaint on and off, you can see that we're actually seeing our Polypaint right now. There's a couple other control painting options I want to show you. So I'm going to go back to my clone here, and I'm going to turn on Enable Control Painting. And I'm going to go to Density. Now, density allows us to control texture density. Now, in visual effects, I've never actually found myself doing this in a visual effects pipeline, but it's important to understand that you can do it. I think it's probably used more often in real time. What this allows you to do is control how much texture space one area of a mesh gets compared to others. So density here, you can do a fourth density, a third, 1/2, 1, or 2 times the density, 3 times the density, 4 times the density. So to make this very, very clear, I'm going to do 4 times density. Now you'll notice that this is green. And these numbers, if you look, they're going to change from green to blue. And the lower the number on the positive end of the spectrum, you know, times 4, times 3, times 2, that's different saturations of green. Going into halves, thirds, and quarters, it's in blues. Again, the saturation changing. So if I go to 4 times density, turn my brush up, and then paint here, I'm going to be painting this green onto the character's face. Let's say I don't want this area here. I'll click Erase. Oops. Actually, what I'll do is I'll just select white. And then paint that out. There we go. So now I've got the density for the face, paint it in. Now, if I unwrap again, and then flatten, you see what happens is we get 4 times the density in the face than we would have otherwise. Actually, I don't think that worked. Let me unflatten that, turn density on, and then unwrap. It's a bit hard to see. Let's try doing a quarter density. Let's paint that here. Flatten. And there we go. That's much, much easier to see. So that gets a quarter of the density of the rest of the head. So it shrunk those UVs down, so they're getting 1/4 the density of everything else. If I unflatten, and let's change this, we'll turn on density again, and let's go ahead and do 1/2. Paint 1/2 in this area here. Unwrap, and then click flatten. You see it's gotten a bit larger. Let's unflatten that. Let's go to density and go to 1. And then that's just painting white. It's effectively erasing that area. Now, if we unwrap again and flatten, you see it's back to normal. So if I turn on density, here you go, you see we have the option. This toggles between magnification or reduction. So if we click that, we can toggle between the two. And here we can change the strength, the density control painting, rather than just using these direct buttons here. I would probably rely on these buttons. Like I say, this is not something that I think you're going to find yourself using, but I wanted you to understand why it's here. I've never had occasion to alter my UVs in such a way. I think maybe 14 years ago I might have on something for a commercial, but it's not something that I encounter in a visual effects pipeline. But it's important to know that it's here. And again, it's something that I think in real time you may run into this more often. But most important is going to be the protect, attract, and erase here. You can also use this button here. This will attract seams from ambient occlusion. Ambient occlusion is shadowing algorithm based on areas that have shadow. Like here, where 2 areas are close to one another, you'll get ambient occlusion. This can be handy because it's going to naturally place your seams in areas like that, which are shaded. So you could do something like that. You'll notice that it's automatically placed the blue painting, the attraction, in areas where we just went to paint them already. And then I would go to protect, and I would just paint protect over anything that I didn't want to have a seam on it, like the front of the face. So in very, very complex objects, you might elect to use something like that. It's nice to know that it's there, but generally for character work, just being able to paint these broad areas of protection and then a narrow band of attraction would work best. So let's take a look at a different model now. Let's take a look at the Hellhound, and let's talk about breaking things up. So here we've switched over to our Hellhound model. And again, these meshes are available for you in the downloads, so you can experiment with these on your own. Now, the reason we're going to use this model is because it's been broken up into polygroups. If I step down to my lowest subdivision level and then go into frame mode with Shift F, you see that we have these color-coded selections of mesh. Polygroups are basically just face groups in ZBrush that have a color tag applied to them, so you can very easily Control-Shift-Click on them to hide them, Control-Shift-Click on the background to show all again, or I can hide that, then click on it again with Control-Shift-Click, and it will hide and show everything else, and then everything else that I click on will be hidden. Control-Shift-Click and drag on the background will invert visibility. So at their base, polygroups are really useful for organizing your model to work on it, and we use them throughout these lessons. We'll use them when we do import meshes. We'll use them in some other capacities as well. They're just really, really handy in ZBrush. Now we can create them manually, which we're going to do in this lesson. However, let's say, for example, you created this base mesh in Maya using QuadDraw. In Maya, if you make a selection of some faces and then apply a material to those faces, you can bring that OBJ into ZBrush, and everything that has a different material assigned to it will get its own polygroup, so you can have your polygroups generated automatically. You'll do that by going to your Preferences menu, and here under Import Export, under the Import menu, there is a button called Import Matte as Groups. That's Import Materials as Polygroups. If you turn that on and then import an OBJ file, any faces that have a different material tag will come in as a different polygroup. So let's look at how to set up these polygroups manually here in ZBrush and then how to unwrap based upon those. The reason we want to do this, if I go down to UV Map and then click Morph UV, you see that we have actually broken this model up into polygroups, and then we've extracted, or we've unwrapped based on those edges. So we created where our islands are going to be just by using polygroups to define them. So let's turn off Morph UV, and I will go to Polygroups. Or that's Polypaint. I'll go to Polygroups and I will click Group Visible, and that clears all of my polygrouping. Now for something like this, it's a bit easier to use the selection lasso. The selection tools are under Control Shift, the Control Shift brush. Now by default, your selection brush is going to be Selection Rectangle. Selection Rectangle looks like this. Control Shift, click and drag, draws a green rectangle. If I let go of Control Shift and then press Alt, it becomes red. So anything inside of this rectangle will be hidden. Now, before I let go of my mouse button, if I press spacebar, I can move this around the screen. So I can hide the hands, for example. Or I can draw another rectangle, press Alt, and that becomes hide now. Press spacebar, and I can move that up here. And any face that I capture a single vertex from will be hidden. Control Shift, click and drag on the background will invert that visibility. Control Shift, click on the background, reveals all. I'm going to turn off perspective so we're looking straight down an orthographic side view. And I'm going to go to B for brush, S for select, and I'm going to change to the lasso brush. Now I don't need this to come up every time, so I'm going to click skip this note till next restart. So now you see I've got a selection lasso. So we're going to start by isolating the hands because I want the hands to have a separate UV shell. Let's focus in on those, and if we zoom out here and rotate around, it looks like we missed a couple faces there. So I'm going to Control Shift, click and drag on the background. That inverts my visibility, and then if I hide these faces here and then invert my visibility again, now I have a polygroup just for the hands. So in the polygroup menu, I'm going to click Auto Groups, and that will give me a separate group for each hand. If I click Group Visible, it will give the same polygroup to both of those hands. So now I want to isolate the fingers. So I'm going to Control Shift, click and drag, and I'm going to draw a lasso around the base of the fingers here. Now we caught a little extra edge there. Now, something that can be handy when you're trying to spot things like this, you notice when I rotate around to the underside, or to the hidden side, I can see through my polygons. If I go to the tool menu, go to the bottom under display properties, I have the option to turn on double-sided. So that makes it a lot easier to see where we may be going wrong. So let's go ahead and hide this face here just by lassoing around one vertex. Looks like we caught a little extra one there, so we may need to zoom in a bit to do this more effectively and turn our draw size down. And let's hide that. Hide that. We're going to hide these. And those, let's go ahead and hide that. And because I have X symmetry turned on, oh, I actually don't have X symmetry turned on. If I had X symmetry turned on, it would do that symmetrically. So let's do that again with X symmetry turned on. Just do a lasso around these fingers. Let's get them right down to the root of the finger there. And now if I zoom out, you see we got both sides. We'll zoom in, and I just want to effectively hide that one. Oops. That's a shared face there, so we're going to get rid of these here. And probably not going to be able to get rid of that one right there, but we'll try. No, let's undo that. And let's just go ahead and hide these along here. There we go. Now, I want to give a separate poly group for each finger because I want each finger to have its own island of UVs. So I'll go to Polygroups, Auto Group. Now each finger gets its own polygroup. Control-Shift-Click on the background, and now you can see that we've got our hands and our fingers separated. Now, maybe I want the back of the hand and the palm to have two separate polygroups as well. Now, this is the benefit of having an organized mesh here. If we've got an edge loop that runs all the way around this area, I can then go to Control-Shift, and because I'm in lasso mode, now this does not work if I'm on selection rectangle. Control-Shift doesn't give me this option. But if I go back to select lasso, I can Control-Shift-Click on an edge, and that will hide that poly loop, or that poly ring. So I'm going to hide along there, and let's hide along here. Along here, here, and here. I just want to separate the front and the back out. Now, I don't want that edge ring to go, so I just want that face to disappear. So I'll Control-Shift-Click on that. Oops. Let me zoom in on that. I will Control-Shift, click, drag a lasso. No, it's not going to let me do that, but that's fine. That's just one point of connection. That shouldn't be a problem. So there we go, and I've got it on both sides. So let's see. If I do an auto group now, those are still two connected. So what I'm going to need to do is just get a little bit of a view here. There we go. Get rid of that. Get rid of that. Get rid of that. Oops. Undo those. Let's zoom in there and get that a little bit more specific. There we go. We'll do something like this. There we go. So that's going to give us that, and we'll just keep hiding these rings here. There we go. So now we've got the underside of the hands. And I will just click Auto Group, Control-Shift-Click to reveal all. So now you see we've got a polygroup for the back of the hand, a polygroup for the palms, and polygroups for the fingers. So we'll move up the body here. Control-Shift-Click, excuse me, Control-Shift-Click to isolate the rest of the body here. And I will hide right up to this ring here. Now, if I get a nice clean hide here, now you see I've accidentally hidden a portion of the torso. So if I invert my visibility and then hide that and then invert it again, I can now go to my visibility menu and I can click Shrink. And I can start shrinking that visibility ring by ring up to about there. Now I will just go to Polygroups and I will click Group Visible. Now you see the body will have a different polygroup from the arms, the hands, and the fingers. Let's do the same thing for the head. I'll do a lasso here around the neck. Try and get it as clean as possible. Oh, that's pretty clean. And I will group visible. Now let's do another one for the head. Let's try and follow that edge ring as closely as possible. Now I want to clean up this edge here, so I'll Control-Shift-Click on these edge rings, and that'll just clean that up for me. So we got a little extra face there. Let's invert our visibility there. Let's go back, press the F key if we get stuck on one particular view. There we go. And I'm just going to turn off my X symmetry and hide just those faces. Now I've got the head itself isolated, and I will click Group Visible. So let's say that we want just the torso to have its own polygroup. So what I'll do is I will use my visibility marquee here to sort of isolate the torso area. Or alternately, what I could do is I could isolate the legs. So let's do this. Let's Control-Shift-Click. I'm going to go back to my selection rectangle, so I'm not getting the edge ring selection anymore. And then we'll go to B for brush, S for select, go back to select lasso, and I will Control-Shift-Click on this edge ring here. You see that edge ring shoots off around the leg there, but it also gives me this nice ring going around the body. So what I can do now is I can do auto groups, and that will give me separate groups for these parts, and that hidden ring gets a separate group, but that's actually fine. I'm going to isolate the torso here. I am going to isolate the tail. So let's do this. Let's hide that tail. And I'm just going to clean this up using my visibility marquee like this. Let's invert our visibility, and let's see if we can't get a nicer sort of ring here. Let's Control-Shift-Click along this. Let's follow that edge ring. It's a little tangled up there around the bum, but let's see if that will give us a decent flow there. There we go. And those little bits right there we can just manually hide like this. There we go. And now I will use a visibility marquee just going around that tail that we just cleaned up and go to Group Visible. So I've got a separate group for the tail, a separate group for the torso, and let's go ahead and get the hips separated out as well. I will go ahead and isolate this edge ring here. So you see that the hips are now separated from the torso entirely, and if we auto group that, the hips and the torso get two separate groups now. Now I'm going to go to my leg, oops, go to the leg, and go to this ring here. Invert my visibility, and I'm just going to hide this section of that ring. See, we get a nice edge running around that, and I'll click Group Visible. Let's isolate this, isolate this. Let's hide that, those hips. There we go. And I'm going to hide that leg and Group Visible. There we go. I'm going to turn my X symmetry back on, so I'm doing both sides of the mesh at one time. So lastly, we'll just do the feet. And I'm just going to do a Control-Shift-Click and drag visibility marquee like so. And I'll go to visibility, and let's try and shrink that down and see if we get a good ring there. F for focus if we find that we're not able to rotate around the area we want. I'm going to grow that, grow, and that's a bit better. So I'm going to invert my visibility, and I just want to get that little stray bit right there by hiding it. Invert visibility again, and polygroups, auto group. Control-Shift-Click on the background, and here we go. We have now organized this into a selection of polygroups. Now you could go even further. You could isolate the jaw, for example, if I wanted to isolate the head. And I've been using the mouse for something like this. It might be easier to go ahead and use the tablet pen. So if I were to trace around this ring here, invert that visibility, then we can just manually sort of clean up by hiding things. Let's look at that ring right there. We probably don't want this. So let's go ahead and hide these. Let's solo this so the mouth isn't in the way. And Control-Shift-Click, hold down the Alt key so we're hiding. We can hide these. We can hide these and these. Let's get that one. And let's get that one. Oops, undo. zoom in there and make sure that we get around those faces like that. There we go, polygroups, group visible. So once we've got this established, what we can do is go back over to UV Master. In UV Master, I will turn on polygroups. Remember, polygroups takes into account the polygrouping. And I'm going to click Work on Clone. That clones the mesh. It deletes any subdivision levels on it. It just gives me a single mesh with no subdivs. Polygroups is on, symmetry is on. And let's turn off check seams and click Unwrap. Now what this is going to do, it's going to give me a symmetrical unwrap using my existing polygrouping. So if I click Flatten, you can see that it's laid this out based on those UV or those islands that I created by using polygrouping. Looks like we got a couple stray strips there. So if I go back to unflatten, believe I see where those are. If I Control Shift click, I'm going to go to B for brush, S for select, and R for rectangle. Let's hide that and that, and yep, that's that strip. That's that problematic strip there. So what I'll do is I will go to B for brush, S for select, L for lasso, and I'm going to Control Shift click on that edge ring, and I'm going to hide these. I'm going to hide this. I'm going to invert my visibility, and I just want to merge those into the torso. So I'm going to hide the torso as well, invert my visibility. I'm going to hide these little hanging faces here, and I will go to polygroups. You guessed it, group visible. Invert my visibility, and you see that I've got this ring here that I want to incorporate into the pelvis. So I'll hide the pelvis. Let's reveal all. I'll hide the pelvis. And I'm going to just do a little selection marquee around this to hide that ring. Invert my visibility, and then I will do group visible. Now if I unwrap again, you'll see we'll get a cleaner result. So let's go to unwrap, flatten, and looks like we got rid of one of them, but there's another one hanging out there. So let's go ahead and unflatten that. Now we can go to UV map. Our autosave is kicking in. Autosave is a relatively, well, it's not a new feature, but the ability to cancel out of it is new. As of the previous version of ZBrush, if you press the escape key, you can cancel your autosave. As I'm working, I'll often press the number 9. I don't use that to replace my saving manually, but it does allow me to just quickly kick off an autosave, which will be in the quick save folder in the ZBrush install folder. So if I go to UV map and click morph UV, this is something handy. So if I want to see where these edges are, if I just click morph UV again, I can kind of follow them and be like, oh, I saw that went over here. So let's look back here and morph UV. I see that that is branching off this little bit here. So that's ZBrush trying to deal with this sort of bifurcated segment of body here. So let's isolate that and make sure that our X symmetry is turned on. Let's do both legs here. And I'm going to hide these and give them a separate polygroup, and that's going to allow ZBrush to make an island for this particular area of the leg, and it's going to be easier for it to create a more efficient edge UV layout. We want to get that little hanging bit right there. There we go. So F for focus, and I'm going to click polygroups, autogroup. Control Shift click on the background to reveal all, and there we go. So now let's do our unwrap again and flatten. There you see it's taking care of that. ZBrush was not reading a polygroup there. It was just splitting off that strip, because what it's trying to do is give you the most efficient UV layout that's human readable that does not give you distortion. So it's balancing all those things at the same time. So if I'm happy with this, I will unflatten, check my seams just to see where those seams are running, and they're going to be hard to see in frame mode, so I'll turn on Shift F. Now, as always, I can come in here and do control painting, as we've already seen, to protect areas and attract areas. So you'll have to decide where you want those seams to be. If this character is seen from the back more often than the underside, usually I would place seams on the insides of the legs and arms, underarms, along the back, depending again on what angle the character is most often seen from. So all the UVs that we generate in ZBrush, if I flatten this again, let's copy these UVs and go back to our Hellhound. And we'll paste them here. Let's go to Paste UVs. So we've now transferred our UVs over. Now you'll notice if I go into UV Map, and we morph these UVs again, these UVs only live in a single square. Now, it is possible to have UVs that are outside of this square. This square is called UV region 0 to 1, or UDIM 1001. UDIMs and UV regions are basically the same thing, it's just a difference in numbering. Now, ZBrush doesn't allow you to generate UVs outside 0 to 1, but it will read UVs outside 0 to 1, and it will do that using UV Master, and it will extract UVs outside 0 to 1 using Multimap Exporter here, which we talk about in a different chapter. So if I were to take this model, let's morph UV back to its original form, and if I go to Tool, Export, I can export this as an OBJ. So we'll export this as Hellhound 1 UDIM. Now I will take this into Maya, and I'm going to shift these outside. So here in Maya, we've loaded up the Hellhound model, and I have it set so there are border edges showing around my UV borders. Over here, I have the UV view. Now, here you can see quite clearly we've got our UV region established by this square. That's UV 0 to 1, or UDIM 1001. It goes up to 10, and then it goes up this way. So why would we do this? You have a 4K map. That's 4K square. If you wanted the entire character's texture to be carried in one map, you can only have so much resolution. However, if I were to take these UVs and then scale them up and then move the shells across to other UV regions, I could have a 4K map for the torso, another one for the tail, another one for the legs. So you can have much, much, much more texture density. So let's go ahead and scale that down a little bit so we can actually get these, get these laid out. Now, like I said, ZBrush won't generate UVs this way, but you can start your UVs in ZBrush, expand them out across multiple UDIMs, and then bring it back into ZBrush to extract maps. Again, we have a lesson specifically on extracting maps where we will use a model that has multiple UDIMs like this. But I just want to show you just very, very quickly that if I were to, for example, place the UVs like this, and then I'm going to right click and go to UV shells. So now I'm selecting UV shells. And I want to select these shells here, and I'll shift select those. Go to my UV toolkit over here on the right hand side of the screen, go to transform, make sure my move unit's set to 1, and I can just shift these over and down, and maybe move that like so. The important thing is that I scaled everything together because we don't want to have inconsistent scaling in our UVs. So we'll place these here. This is quick and dirty. Generally, you want to organize the placement of your shells, but the point of this is just to show you how this is done. So when we do get to the section where we are manipulating these shells, or where we are extracting maps for these shells, you understand where they came from. I would probably I would definitely clean this UV up if it were going to be going into a pipeline. But here you see what I'm doing is I'm just making sure that all these shells here live inside their own square. Nothing overlaps, so I can't have anything overlapping these black lines. This also gives us an opportunity to illustrate how you can copy and paste UVs from outside of ZBrush in ZBrush. So I'll move this here. We'll grab this little orphan shell, put that, oh, there's a couple there. Let's marquee select those, bring them up here. I think these are actually the fingers and the hands. Again, there's a whole discipline to organizing your UVs, and this is not organization, which I am doing here. This is just to break these out across multiple UDIMs so you understand what's happening. Let's place this one here, make sure that that actually fits. Now these two are probably going to be too big. Even if I were to rotate this, I don't think we're going to be able to make that fit. So what I'll probably do in this case is select an edge. So I will double click this edge here, and over here in this window I will just do a frame F for focus on that, and that's down there at the base of the tail. And I'll go to, that might not even be quite enough. Let's go ahead and double click this edge here. I'll go to cut so and cut that, and that gives me another shell there. And we'll take that, move it over here, take this, move it here. Now we could probably place this one here. And because I added that cut, I'm just going to shift select those and then shift right click and go to unfold. Oops. Go to unfold. My marking menu has a delay on it. Go to unfold, and we'll just unfold those again. There we go. And then I'll take this one, bring it over here. Now remember, we can take advantage of all the way over to 10, so I'm going to select these, and I'm going to click the little button here to move, 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 and then move them down. You don't want to place them down here, over here, and over here. This is a Cartesian coordinate system, so these are negative values. We don't want to use those. We want to just use the positive values here. So I will go back into object mode, select this, and then go to File, Export Selection, and I will export this OBJ as Hellhound multiple UDIMs. Now here we are back in ZBrush. I will go to the Polymesh star, and I will go to Import, and from there I am going to import the Hellhound UDIMs OBJ file. Now, if we go to UV map and morph UV, you see it morphs the UVs flat, but they're all stacked on top of each other. The reason is ZBrush in this window does not see the UDIMs separately. However, if I go into UV Master and click Flatten, UV Master, on the other hand, sees those UDIMs. So if I want to take this UV set, let's unflatten that. I will copy those UVs. Let's go back to our Hellhound here. Remember, the UVs here are just a single UDIM. If I click Paste UVs and then Morph UV again, you can see it has applied all of those to this model. Now, in our chapter on map extraction, we'll talk about how to extract our polypaint, normal maps, and displacement across those multiple UDIMs, so we can have multiple 4K maps or even higher resolution, but generally 4K is enough when you're using UDIMs, using multi-map exporters. That is a separate chapter. So the last thing I want to talk about before we move on uses this shirt model here. Here I've got a costume shirt, and if I were to step down my subdivision levels and morph UV on this, let's go to UV map and morph UV. Here you see we've got some islands which are pretty clearly laid out for the front of the shirt, back of the shirt, and the sleeves. So this is a neat trick that was introduced in the last version of ZBrush, ZBrush 2020. If I step up my subdivision levels, and let's say I want to create a seam that runs from here to here, going straight down the arm. That might be difficult to do in this situation here. However, if I were to, let's say, go to Morph UV, I'm going to put two little guides here so I know where I want my seam to start and end. So I'm going to go to my standard brush, turn on RGB, turn off Z-Add, and I'm going to, let's just switch color to black. And I'm going to put a little black dot here, and I'm going to put a little black dot here. So I want my seam to run from there to there. Now, if I try to take the damn standard brush, for example, and I try to sculpt a seam along there, even if I'm using Lazy Mouse, even if I'm using Backtrack, it would be a little tricky. But if I go to UV Map and Morph UV, as of the last version of ZBrush, we're able to actually sculpt and paint in this view. So watch this. If I take my damn standard brush, I'll go to my stroke menu. We talk about the stroke menu more in another chapter, but if I go to Lazy Mouse is turned on. That just gives me a delay on my stroke. If I turn on Backtrack, turn on Line, turn on Snap to Track. Now this is a flat object, so we don't have to worry about track curvature, but I always turn that up. Just it's a good habit. This allows me to create a stroke like this. Now, let me make sure that you see X symmetry right now. It's working on this plane, so I need to turn that off. I'll have to do this on each side individually. So here, I will start from this point. I'll drag my line out to the other point there, and then I'll backtrack along it. And you see what it's doing there? It's creating a seam. Maybe I want to increase my draw size just a little bit. I'll turn it up to maybe 6. And remember, if we go to stroke, modifiers, remember we have that replay last button. I have a hotkey set for it. We talk about setting a hotkey for that in the hotkeys chapter. Alt-1 will replay that stroke. So now I've got a straight line that I've sculpted in UV view. If I then morph back, I have a seam that runs exactly down that length from point A to point B, exactly as I wanted it to. So this is a really handy thing that you can do with that Morph UV. You can sculpt in here and you can paint in here. So it's very similar to painting in UV view in Mari, for example, or Substance Painter. And for some of you, it might be a very familiar way of painting. So I just wanted to point that out before we close this chapter. So this was a lot of information on UVs. If you've never heard of UVs before, I hope this helped clarify what they are and why you need to use them. And if you do incorporate them into your workflow already, I hope this shows some new methods and new tips and tricks that you can utilize to speed up your workflow. So thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next chapter.